Hello and welcome. Today we're pleased to have back Alexander Grace from Red Pill Interviews. Alexander, thank you for joining us. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. Now, we've been having lots of conversations recently about the sexual marketplace. We've talked about how the dating market works, how people compete with each other, and how to use all of that information to your advantage. For anyone who missed those discussions, we can put a link in the description box below. That's right, but so far we've only really explored how the dating market works here in the West, places like North America and Western Europe. What's important to know is that the way our dating market is constructed is heavily informed by our culture. And so the principles that underlie the dating market here in the West aren't necessarily transferable when you look at the dating markets of other countries and other parts of the world. So you're saying that our dating market here in the West isn't based purely off of biological principles, it's dependent on culture as well. Yes, context is very important in how a dating market works. I'll demonstrate this using a very simple example. So I've had friends who've worked in theatre, and they've described to me how dating works in that context. Now, in the theatre world, there is a disproportionately large number of gay men, at least when compared to the general population. And so in the context of theatre, there are so many more straight men to straight women. And so the ratio is extremely favourable to the men. Let me guess, all of the females are competing over the few straight men? That's right, and it's a perfect demonstration of supply and demand. Because there are fewer straight men, they have a lot more control over who they date and what level of commitment they offer. So, would the same be true for women in the reverse situation? Definitely. If you take an average woman off the street and you put her in a heavily male context, something like construction work or the tech industry, you'll find that men are treating her like she's a model. The supply of women is so low that the demand naturally just goes up. So, how does this apply to the dating markets of other cultures? Look, let me be completely forthright here. I'm not an expert on other cultures. I've only been overseas a couple of times, and so I would encourage people to look to their own experiences first. Having said that, there are some things I have generally found to be true, that most cultures outside of the Western world tend to be more socially conservative. So if you look to Asia, Africa, the Middle East, Eastern Europe, South America, all of those cultures tend to be more traditional. By traditional, do you mean more old-fashioned? That's right. Though some cultures have come further than others, a lot of the world is still run according to a sort of top-down patriarchy model, where the father's the head of the household, and both men and women are sort of constricted to narrowly defined social roles. So it's like feminism hasn't happened yet. In a sense. See, Western values are sweeping across the globe, but in some places it's happening very slowly. And then there are other places that aren't even interested in Western values. They're happy with how things are. Can you give me an example? Well, here in the West, we've made a lot of progress with women's rights. And so, even though there are always going to be areas for adjustment and improvement, on the whole, I think regular people would agree that women have freedom of choice and equality of opportunity, and that this is a good thing. We celebrate that too. We look at a woman who's confident and outspoken and we think, good for her. But that's because we come from a culture of individualism, where we celebrate independence and free thinking. See, other cultures place a higher value on things like conformity, tradition, deference to authority, that sort of thing. So what do people from those cultures think of a Western woman who's independent and outspoken? To be honest, the perception can be quite negative. Of course, not all of the time, but often, even if she's just expressing her thoughts, if she's in a very socially conservative culture, she can come across as bossy, aggressive, unpleasant. So her actions are being seen through a cultural lens. That's right. It's a well-known cultural phenomenon that expat women, that's Western women who move overseas to live, have a really hard time dating. The local men just avoid them. That surprises me. I would have thought that they'd be in high demand, seen as some exotic creature with different coloured skin. That's often what the women think too, and they get a rude shock when they arrive. Either the local men find the women too intimidating, or they just want a woman who's more in line with the social norms that they're comfortable with. But either way, Western women often spend their time overseas single and alone. I guess they can always date the expat men. It may surprise you to know that the expat men don't want to date the expat women either, even though the men outnumber them 5-1. What? Why? That doesn't make any sense. According to the laws of supply and demand, if Western women are such a rarity, then the demand from Western men should be quite high. It doesn't work that way because the expat men are busy dating the local women. But aren't they perceived to be obnoxious and bossy like the Western women are? Perhaps, but being outspoken and confident isn't necessarily a problem in those cultures so long as you're a male. In fact, they can be highly desirable characteristics. It shows that you're confident and a good leader. In lots of parts of the world, being a Western male makes you in very high demand. But that's a complete double standard. Why are the women being judged if the men aren't? I don't have all the answers. Like I said, this is not my area of expertise. And I'm not even saying whether or not this is a good or a bad thing. I'm just describing the facts. So a lot of these cultures want women to be meek and submissive, but they want the men to be confident and outgoing. As a very basic simplification, yes. Let me give you an example. I have a Thai friend who now lives in Australia, and she explained to me why her friends would prefer to date Western men. She says that Thai men are too passive, they lack ambition, they often live with their parents well into their 20s and 30s, and that's normal in their culture. So when they compare them to Western men who are ambitious, masculine, and financially independent, the Thai men just have difficulty competing. If the women from these countries are encouraged to be extremely feminine, I'm surprised they're not frightened off by strongly masculine Western men. Perhaps some are, but what a lot of men have noticed when traveling to places like Southeast Asia is that if they're considered a sort of feminine kind of guy back home, when they go to these cultures, their masculinity suddenly becomes a lot more obvious. This makes me think of that stereotype of the nerdy white guy who only dates Asian girls. Well, there is some truth to that stereotype. Men like to feel masculine, they like to feel strong and in charge, but a lot of feminine kind of guys find that Western women are just too much and their masculinity is just getting drowned out. Now, if they find themselves with a softly spoken Asian girlfriend, well, that's their first chance to really come into their own and demonstrate their masculinity inside a relationship. So, are the expat men dating all of the local girls because they want to see what it's like to date someone more traditionally feminine? Often that's the case, especially if he's had bad experiences with Western women who are overly critical and demanding. An Asian woman who's just nice and generous can seem to him like a breath of fresh air. But for others, it's more about just enjoying the experience of being a high-value male. What do you mean by that? Well, for some men, in the local dating market of the West, they're considered a low-value male, someone that women wouldn't even look at. But if they go overseas to another culture, particularly if that culture has a favorable exchange rate for the currency, where his even modest income can suddenly make him quite wealthy, well then in this new culture, he gets to enjoy the experience of being a high-value male. So what's that experience like? It's the same experience that high-value men enjoy having here in the West. So it's having access to the most beautiful women on the market, it's getting to date according to your own terms, set your own conditions. It's for the first time having women throw themselves at you, women competing over you. For a lot of guys, this is their first ever experience of that. They're loving it. They're living like a king. And what's most appealing is that in order to reach the top of the food chain, they didn't need to put in nearly as much effort as they would have had to back home. What they really needed to do was just to sell their product in a different market. But don't those men seem a little pathetic to you? Like they can't handle a real Western woman, and so they have to run off to fantasy land and date in a market that's completely rigged in their favor. I don't think that it's my place to judge them. One of the consequences of living in our individualistic society here in the West is that there's a strong divide between the winners and the losers. And it can't be easy to go through life working and struggling without ever really seeing a reward for your sacrifice. But how would you feel if you saw some fat, ugly old guy walking down the streets of Thailand and he had a pretty young Thai girl on his arm? I mean, doesn't that make you a little sad? I'll admit, years ago I would have been quite judgmental. I would have looked at the situation and thought that the old guy was taking advantage of the situation, sort of cheating in a way. But my perspective has shifted. Now I see it as two consenting adults both giving each other what the other wants. If he wants to feel what it's like to be a winner, to have a beautiful young girl in his arms showing him love and affection, then what's the harm, really? I hope it makes him happy. I think you're looking at this situation too benevolently. You paint this picture of some friendly old guy who's just having fun at the end of his life, but what about those men who are just angry at feminism for taking away male power, and so they go to these countries just to live out their fantasy of having a wife who's essentially a slave? You know what? I agree with you. I think there is a danger in that. I think there are some men, not many, but some, who would specifically seek out a woman from a culture where women are encouraged to be compliant simply because he's threatened by a woman with a mind of her own. So you don't approve of men exerting that kind of dominance? Definitely not. There's a big difference between a dominant-submissive dynamic that's fun and playful in a sexual way, and a man who actually believes that he's superior to women and feels entitled to order her around. But some people in the Red Pill community seem to idealize the olden days, where women were dutiful wives and just did whatever their husbands asked them to. Well, then this is a point of departure for me. I'm in favor of redressing those concerns raised by the men's rights activists in Cassie Jaye's Red Pill documentary, absolutely. And I'm no fan of third-wave feminism, but I'm a big fan of second-wave feminism, and I'm a strong believer in women's rights. So you believe that women should have all of the rights and freedoms that men do? Absolutely. I might not like feminism in its current form, but I'm unequivocally in support of women having freedom of choice and equality of opportunity. I think that there has been a lot of social upheaval since the rise of second-wave feminism, and we as a society, we're still having conversations about how to navigate these changes. But whatever the solution is, I think we're going to find it looking forward, not backward. So why do so many people look to the olden days, with its strictly defined social roles, as a solution to modern problems? I honestly don't think that many people do. I know I said before that my views might be a departure, but I actually believe that most people in the Red Pill community think the same way that I do. You know, we don't want women back in the kitchen as domestic slaves. We celebrate the progress that's been made. You know, we're also keen for some progress to be made for men's issues, but that doesn't mean taking away what's been granted to women. That's good stuff. I think that the people who advocate for things returning to how they were 100 years ago are a very small but vocal minority within the community. So then, why does everyone have this perception of the Red Pill community as a bunch of women-hating men who want to re-establish a patriarchy? We're getting a little bit off topic here, but I think that the reason that perception of the Red Pill community exists is probably because the media is heavily invested in the ideology of third-wave feminism, and they also just like to sensationalize things, so when they're doing their research, that's what they're looking for. Are you saying that they focus on and cherry-pick those comments made by the most extreme members? Exactly. For third-wave feminists, and for people who Jordan Peterson would describe as postmodernists, it works in their favor to paint Red Pill ideas as extremist or fringe. That way, the legitimate issues that the Red Pill community talks about, and the ones that we discuss here in this channel, can be safely ignored. Okay then, so just for extra clarification, are you in favor of men going overseas so they can have success in a different dating market? I'm neither for or against it. I'm just reporting the facts. That women from more socially conservative cultures outside of the West seem to have a lower trading price on the dating market with Western men. But you're not encouraging men to go and try this. It depends what his reasons are. Like I said before, if he wants a slave wife who's just going to do whatever he wants and never question his authority, then I think he has some serious self-reflection to do. But just because there's a few bad apples, that doesn't mean that it should spoil the party for everyone. So every individual is different and they should be treated on a case-by-case basis. That's right. Things are hard for men in the West. We're living in a time where women have a strong belief in their own high value, and lots of men just feel like they can't live up to those standards, or even think that the payoff is necessarily worth it. So if you're not having success here in the West, why not move to another dating market? You have every right to pursue your happiness, and who knows, you might find that in another culture. Aren't you worried that Western women will be angry if there's this mass exodus of men who leave to other countries to date their women? I would say this: you are under no obligation to continue playing a game that you're losing. Overseas, the odds are better stacked in your favor. Give it a shot. But you're not concerned about the response from Western women. I understand that this will cause some antagonism from women who don't like the idea of all the men running off with foreigners, but they're just frightened that they're going to be undercut by the competition. This is what we talked about in our last video, when you spoke about how women get angry with other women when they sell themselves too cheap in the dating market, because overall it devalues the product. That's exactly right. So if you've got a bunch of women from foreign cultures who are being kind to these men, being sexually available and undemanding, then that's some pretty stiff competition for a Western woman who's used to getting whatever she wants. She's used to men competing over her, even if she doesn't put in any effort. I guess if enough men seek long-term partners from overseas, then Western women will be forced to lower their prices in the sexual marketplace just to stay competitive. That's exactly right, and some women really don't want to do that. If you haven't seen it yet, you really should watch this video clip of a British dating coach who's explaining to a news panel why he's encouraging men to go overseas to Russia in order to find long-term partners. What are his reasons? He says that Russian women are kind, feminine, beautiful, and that British women are overweight and entitled. He makes some interesting points, but what's really fascinating is the reaction from the 3 women on the panel. They hate him. One of them says that she's so angry that she can barely talk. It's really fascinating. Interesting. We'll be sure to put a link in the description box below for anyone who wants to see that full discussion. But before we finish up, is there anything else that you want to mention? I'd just like to reiterate that I'm not an expert on other cultures. When I was doing research for this topic, I did find it very difficult to find reliable information about how the dating markets of other cultures worked. So what I'd like to do is ask the audience for help. If you're from a non-Western culture, please comment below and tell me how the dating market is different in your country than it is here in the West. Go into as much detail as you can. I'm also interested in hearing from people who have gone overseas and tried out other dating markets and what their experiences were like. Be sure to hit that like button and make sure you've subscribed to the channel. If you haven't done so yet, please be sure to head over to our Patreon page. There's a link in the description box below, and that's the best way you can show your support for this channel and help out the creator. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll catch you again next time.